It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. Many of you in the comments have asked me to reveal my theory on this case. Well, in this analysis, we're going to take a big step in that direction. I may not reveal my hand completely, but I will be revealing one of the cards of that hand, and it's this one.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Now, for those who want a brief, concise, to-the-point analysis on the red heart, now might be a good time to let yourself out the door and don't let it hit you on the way out. No, if you don't know me by now, I try very hard to provide a detailed context for information because all context is interconnected and it needs to be interrelated. And through these patterns of interrelatedness, we need to see whether these connections resonate, whether they're real, whether they're authentic. If you want to put up your hand and say, well, I don't think that actually counts as evidence, you'd be absolutely right. But then I think you could also say,
if you can't find that stuff in life, then you, my friend, don't know crap about life.
And if we don't go into some of that crap, if that's the word, then you won't know crap ever about this case.
Are we clear?
But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. This is a video where you might want to take out your notebook and make a couple of notes. Please note I won't be showing any photos of that heart on JonBenet's hand, although those photos are widely publicized online. Also, just a reminder that tomorrow is the day after Christmas and we'll be dealing with two aspects on the day after Christmas. Firstly, the purpose of the ransom note, and then secondly, an analysis of the autopsy report. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, I want to draw your attention to this really excellent article in Time magazine. It really gives you a sense, it gives you like a little window into the timeline, the fabric of the Ramsey case at, I think, around about 8 months after the events. And, this is just a magazine article basically sketching how things stood 8 months later. Let's go to that article. Nearly 8 months after the body of JonBenet Ramsey was found by her father in the basement of the family's hold in Boulder, local authorities under a district court order last week released the full autopsy report on the murdered little girl. Anyone who had predicted last December, when a ransom note found by JonBenet's mother turned later in the day into a homicide investigation, that the big news about the case in August would be the grudging release of the autopsy, well, they would have been called crazy. Now, can you see what they're saying there? Is that the ransom note was this big news, this big crazy aspect. And now, 8 months later, the big news is this grudging release of it. We don't want to release the autopsy. And look at these details in this article. What? No arrests, no charges, no indictments, no trial. And that would turn out to be a very portentous comment because 8 months later, 18 months later, 28 months later, 38 months later, there would be no arrests, no charges, no indictments, no trial. And just have a look at the feelings at the end of this paragraph from the writer of this article from Time. But as last week's development underscored, as it emphasized, the snail's pace of the JonBenet Ramsey murder case continues to defy reasonable expectations. That's a kind way of saying everything that was going on in this case was totally unreasonable, completely inappropriate. That was true in August 1997. And hasn't it been true for the last 28 years, every year since? This article went on to emphasize one particular aspect inside the autopsy report, and we're going to flesh it out a little by going to the autopsy report, the original text. On the middle finger of the right hand is a yellow metal band, basically a ring. Around the right wrist is a yellow metal identification bracelet with the name JonBenet. and then a red ink line drawing in the form of a heart is located on the palm of the left hand. The fingernails of both hands, okay, I'm not going to go any further than that, but now think about that. The heart isn't drawn on her elbow or her ankle. It's drawn in quite a sort of intimate part, which is the palm of her hand. And sometimes when even young children or young people like one another, that is where they might write something like a telephone number. Now, I do anticipate there's going to be a lot of people saying that is not a heart, it's something else. And what I think the best response to that is to just ask a very simple question. What if it is a heart? And you might say, well, I don't believe it is a heart. But what if it is a heart? Then what? And you might say, in my expert opinion, it's not a heart, but the best person to prognosticate on this was the coroner. He actually held her little hand in his hand, studied it up close, and in his opinion, what he was seeing, what he wrote down in the autopsy report, was a drawing in the form of a heart. Do we know that for sure? No. But what if it was a heart? And when was this drawing made? Now, John Ramsey said he was on the floor with Fleet White, JonBenet, and Daphne, that's Fleet's daughter, helping them assemble beads or bits of jewelry. And yet he told Lou Smith as late as June 1998 that he didn't see a heart on her hand when he was at such close quarters with his daughter. I'm not saying he saw something on her hand that looked like something else. He didn't see any kind of drawing on her hand. And so Lou Smith brings this up. He says, one of the things I wanted to ask you is when you were right close to JonBenet, when you were making these jewelry things on Christmas evening, first of all, do you think you would have been close enough to see if there was a heart on her hand, or would you have noticed it? So even Lou Smith, who's the arch apologist for the Ramseys, even he concedes that it's a heart. John Ramsey responds, I think I sure could have. It was on the inside of the palm. So John's basically saying, you know what, I was close enough to see if there was something on her hand. Now, interestingly, it seems to be news to John, Lou mentioning the heart. Anyway, he goes on to say, I heard that just recently. Lou Smith goes on to say, and the heart was in red ink. I don't know what that means. You got any thoughts on that, John? My thoughts after I thought about it was she wouldn't have drawn on herself like that. Now here John reveals that even though he's recently heard about it, he's had enough time to think about it. Now think about this. On May 30th, more than 3 weeks earlier, Jeff Shapiro, an investigative reporter, called John at his home in Atlanta. This is 1998. And he mentioned the red heart, and John's response then, May 30th, was that he'd heard about it recently. And all of this is taking place in May, June 1998. But the red heart was mentioned in the autopsy report had he not read that, because it had been mentioned in the media, for example, from this article from Time, 8 months after the murder, which is many, many months prior to this particular interview, where John is saying, I recently heard it. And so hadn't he read that? Hadn't he read this article in Time? Hadn't he read any of the coverage around this article? When the autopsy had been made public, had no one else mentioned it to him, or sometime in the 10 months following? Because on the very same day the autopsy details were released to the public for the first time, John Ramsey's lawyer released a statement to the Boulder Daily Camera saying, quote, the autopsy details released on Wednesday confirm what we have known for some time. Well, hadn't his lawyer discussed these items making the news to his client? Do you see this reference to the red ink drawing of a heart expressly highlighted in the article in Time, referring to this heart in the palm of JonBenet's left hand? Now, come to think of it, and this is going into a little bit of statement analysis, does John ever mention the heart on her hand? Remember, when John found JonBenet in the basement, he removed the cord from one hand. Do you know which hand that was? And he said the cord was very tight on the other hand. Well, didn't he notice it directly when he was examining his own child? Because the cord that he removed from JonBenet's wrist came from the same hand that had the heart on it. Anyway, let's go back to Lou Smith's questions. John says, it was on the inside of the palm? Probably, Lou Smith. But you didn't notice. John, I didn't notice anything. And here, if you think about it, Lou Smith's concern makes complete sense, because if JonBenet didn't have a heart on her hand on Christmas morning, or on Christmas Day, or immediately after dinner on Christmas night, then this fact and this fact alone, if it is a fact, pours some very cold water on the intruder theory. Now, we don't know this absolutely 100% when this heart was drawn. It just appears as if it wasn't there earlier that day, because John, for example, doesn't observe it, and he's sitting very close to JonBenet. Now, we are not going to provide, as I say, any photographs of either of JonBenet's hands on this platform, but you are welcome to do your own research in that regard, in terms of confirming left hand, right hand, which hand had a cord on, which didn't. Can you see, though, Loosemith has a serious problem, because if JonBenet went home on Christmas night with no red heart drawn on her palm, then it seems the only possibility is that it was drawn on her palm shortly before her death, or one of the few remaining possibilities. Now, why would a savage predator monster do a thing like that? And although John speculated that JonBenet must have drawn it on herself, how could she if, according to his version of events, JonBenet was asleep in the car and went straight to bed when they arrived at home? So do you see, John's opinion on this red heart is that JonBenet drew it on herself. What do you think Patsy's opinion is? Do you think Patsy has the same opinion? Well, it's interesting that Patsy disagreed with John when questioned on the same point. Patsy, who I think knew JonBenet better in this respect, actively discouraged the child beauty queen from drawing on herself, and besides this, had never seen JonBenet drawing hearts on herself. And of course, Patsy would know what JonBenet drew because Patsy was drawing and painting as well, and she was often, I guess, supervising JonBenet, who was drawing right next to her. We just covered that in the previous video. Patsy, she drew suns and things and birds and things like that. Demuth, what was your reaction when you saw that heart on her hand? Patsy, well, I just thought Daphne must have done it or something, that they were playing the night before. So Patsy feels she knows JonBenet so well that she feels like JonBenet would never draw a heart on herself. Maybe another little girl could have done that. Then Patsy's asked, would you draw a smiley face on the palm of her hand or on her hand somewhere? Which seems to be the detective kind of suggesting, could you not have drawn something on her hand, maybe a smiley face? Patsy, have you ever done that before? But Patsy responds quite forcefully, as a matter of fact, I discouraged her doing that because we always did what we call the pageant scrub the night before we have a pageant. We would wash her hair real good and scrub her fingernails and and so on and so on. Demuth, did you ever see a heart on her hand before? Patsy, not specifically a heart. Again, just to reiterate, Patsy thought Daphne must have drawn it on JonBenet, but John was with JonBenet sitting on the floor and didn't notice anything, and neither for that matter did Fleet, presumably. And surely if Daphne did draw the heart, we'd have known that by now.
Let me tell you what I believe.
So, are you ready for me to deal my card? Well, here it is. The autopsy revealed something else besides the red heart, and that is that JonBenet's hair was done up in 2 ponytails. In fact, besides these ponytails, JonBenet still had a ribbon in her hair as well that she wore to the whites that night, as is seen in this final photo, the very last photo of JonBenet. In crime scene photos, this very same ribbon was seen still tied around JonBenet's hair. And as time have had it, some have speculated that JonBenet never went to bed that Christmas night. Well, I'm one of them. Quoting from the article, when she died, JonBenet had a red ink drawing of a heart in the palm of her left hand. Her blonde hair was done up in 2 ponytails, leading some observers to speculate that she had never gone to bed that Christmas night. The autopsy evidence showing JonBenet ate pineapple after her dinner with the whites also supports the notion that JonBenet was awake much later when she was supposedly asleep. Do you see why context is so important, knowing other details beyond singular statements? And I personally don't think this is a bed she would want to sleep in. Would you? Especially not if it reeked of you-know-what. Now, on almost every video I make, I'm bombarded by people telling me who they think did it, and they do so with absolute certainty. An intruder did it. It's so obvious. The DNA, blah, 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 blah. Others are convinced John did it. Others are convinced Patsy did it. Others are convinced Burke did it. So what do I think?
Are you sure you want to hear this?
If we take the red heart seriously, and also if we accept that it is a red heart, and those are two big ifs, and that's especially if it was drawn inside the Ramsey home, that's another if, and I believe there's a strong chance it was, then I don't think it was drawn by JonBenet, right? I believe that JonBenet did not draw that, just as Patsy says. If that's true, I don't think Burke drew that on her hand either. And also, I don't think some intruder did that. Do you agree? So what do I think? I think that heart is real. I think the heart is potentially a big deal. I think it meant something real as well, not just to whoever drew it, but to JonBenet as well. In other words, the red heart potentially takes us into brand new territory, that someone was possibly in the home that wasn't an intruder, but also wasn't a family member either, but was nevertheless someone JonBenet was familiar with, even more than familiar. We also know 2 days earlier, JonBenet was upset at a Christmas party where many other children were present. Why? Because she didn't feel pretty. This is an excerpt from very early on in Steve Thomas's book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. Have a look at this. 6 days later, during a party at her parents' home, a family friend came across a JonBenet who was seldom seen. The child was immaculate in a holiday frock, and her platinum blonde hair was done perfectly. But she sat alone on a staircase in the butler's kitchen, crying softly. The friend sat beside her and said, "What's wrong, honey?" Little Miss Christmas sobbed, "I don't feel pretty." And now she has a heart on her hand. Do you see why context is so important? We have spent so much time speaking for JonBenet, we've never really allowed her to speak for herself. But if we've made progress using the red heart, and if the red heart tells us something about whoever drew it, not only who that someone is, not only that JonBenet liked this someone, but that this someone wasn't an adult, even if that's true, we have another problem. There's something that doesn't quite add up. The knots. Do I think that the someone who tied the knots around JonBenet's wrists and around the paintbrush is the same someone who drew the heart on her palm? And the answer is no. There is obviously a lot more to say about this, but I'm not going to take it further than that, except to note the weirdness surrounding attempts to keep the autopsy report under wraps. The official line was that to release the findings might compromise the criminal investigation. Do you believe that? That's the same line the McCanns use so often when they face difficult questions. As Time notes, the autopsy findings seemed more heartbreaking than harmful, because in a real sense they bring the real JonBenet back to life, and it seems like someone didn't want that to happen. Someone didn't want us to see the real JonBenet. And when we did, we realize, or don't we realize, she's being hidden from us, not only her death, but her life. We also seem to have confirmation, well, at least of a sort, that we've sort of had all along, that this someone was familiar with the house, this someone that we're potentially dealing with. If he was familiar with the house, why would he not be familiar with JonBenet? And if he was familiar with JonBenet, why wouldn't he be familiar with the house? I also want to raise another observation as a final parting shot. If news of JonBenet was zipping around America, the tabloids are snapping it up and trying to bring it out to press as quickly as they can. If every new development was quickly blasted from the rooftops by radio and televisions and tabloids, at the speed of light, the investigation, the prosecution, the legal animal seemed to be lurching forward as slowly as it possibly could. Time magazine, 8 months in, seemed to notice this. After 8 months, nothing had happened. 18 months later, the same. 28 months later, the same. No grand jury, no charges, just a lot of talk and no action. When Detective Steve Thomas finally resigned in disgust, finally there was a little bit of action, but that also then resulted in a dead end. Okay, we have a grand jury, and then what went on for months and months on end? Well, it went nowhere. And so that then raises a question. Was this by accident or by design? I'm talking about the legal machinations. Do you think the case just sort of ended up washing ashore and kind of going nowhere by accident? Or do you think everything that happened was by design? Is the Ramsey case where it is today by accident or by design? And look at this additional comment in Time magazine that I've highlighted. The Ramsey's investigation has been regarded skeptically by many, this is only 8 months in, who see it as an attempt by the affluent couple to deflect attention from themselves. Because what's very interesting is that at almost the same time the autopsy results are released, Team Ramsey placed another big ad in the newspaper, the fourth in 8 months. And what they're trying to do is draw attention back to their insights from the ransom note. Look at this. The ad noted that the killer appears to be obsessed with techno-crime movies and phrases from them, and included quotes from Ransom, Dirty Harry, and Speed that the family says are similar to the ones in the bogus ransom note. Now, what I think is really interesting is if you were to put the narratives side by side that are emerging right here in the timeline in August 1997, on the one hand, the information coming out of the autopsy report, what JonBenet had in her hair, what was written on her hands, the pineapple evidence, the kinds of injuries that she suffered, you put that on one side. And then on the other, you say, no, what we really want to look at is the bogus ransom note, and that had to do with movie quotes. You put those side by side and say, what information is of far greater evidentiary value, far greater import? Which one's the most important? And if you think about it in a very, very simple way, the ransom note is bogus. So why do you even want to look at that? The autopsy report isn't bogus. That's real evidence. So to reiterate, if the ransom note is bogus, then telling people about the type of person who wrote it, if the idea was to use the note to misdirect in the first place, to misdirect in terms of this person's true psychology and who he really was, well, isn't this ad, aren't these so-called insights from the ad doing this all over again? There's a red heart on JonBenet's palm. No, let's ignore that and talk about the ransom note where no ransom was collected and no kidnapping took place. Well, doesn't this feel like an attempt at misdirection all over again? And think about the entire 3-year aftermath to the Ramsey case. 3 years of much ado about nothing, going nowhere slowly, while pretending to want justice. Think about the grand jury as that whole thing being a misdirection. Think about the intruder theory, that whole thing being a misdirection. I don't think Lou Smith thought about it that way, but didn't it end up being that ultimately? And weren't some people deliberately conjuring intruders as a kind of misdirection? And so it raises this question: does someone really want this case solved? Or does someone really not want this case solved? And if this case isn't solved, who does it benefit? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.